and he didn't know how to assert himself. No, no, no. So for your mental okay. Trouble settled. All right, all right. Okay, okay. So she was right up to the lights on there. Okay. I so much appreciate
And I'm just going to introduce
Okay.
you, and then
Sure.
you're going to take it away. Let me just prepare for a quick second. Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. We're running a little bit late. So we're going to get started. Please take your seats and quiet down. Panelists. Welcome back. This panel seems almost like a natural follow-on to the last one, as this is looking at prison and unlocking sort of the secrets of prisons and how do you convey them on in print and in film. Philip Martin is going to moderate. He's at WGBH Boston. He's reported on the Boston Marathon bombings, on the Occupy movement, on a whole host of stories that are very, very relevant to this particular issue at hand. And I am going to let Philip introduce the panelists as he goes along.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Thank you for coming, folks. We're going to be talking about an issue that's gained a lot more prominence over the last few years. That is to say, prisons. A lot of that prominence has come about because of Michelle Alexander's book, you may have seen or read, The New Jim Crow, which talks about racialized systemic control of African Americans and Latino prisoners, focused largely on African American subjugation within the prison system. But within prison, there is another prison, and it's called solitary. It's isolation. And probably the only way to imagine the type of isolation experienced by inmates in this country. Christy Jacobson talks about 100,000 of them in this country. Perhaps the best way to imagine it is to imagine yourself, as one of the inmates said, locked in a bathroom for 3 hours, 4 hours, a year, 2 years. Imagine yourself locked in any small space for an extraordinary, perhaps seemingly interminable amount of time. Prisons are also in the news because yesterday the DOJ launched an investigation into Alabama prisons, the latest of many investigations over the last 3 decades that many people suggest have not produced the results. And it seems the evidence suggests that it has not produced the results we'd like to see. I'd like to introduce you to our panel. Christy Jacobson, as I mentioned, is the director of a film, Solitary. It's an extraordinary documentary. I mean, just absolutely extraordinary because she did something that's amazing. She gained access into a supermax prison, which is, needless to say, very, very difficult to do. Also, Michael Schiller. Michael is the creative director for the Center for Investigative Reporting, responsible for bringing to radio, bringing to life an extraordinary radio version of a Mother Jones article, My 4 Months as a Prison Guard. And Ed Pilkington is the chief reporter at the Guardian. Ed's all the way on the end here. Not in order, obviously. And the Guardian has been able to do some amazing storytelling using very creative ways to illustrate this thing we call solitary confinement. And we'll talk about that later. Pete Early is an author, The Hot House, Life Inside Leavenworth Prison. Leavenworth, of course, is a metaphor for some of the worst prison conditions in the country, like Attica was for prison resistance. And we'd like to throw out a few questions over the course of after their presentations, and then we'd like to open this up to you, the audience, to talk about and to ask questions about about prisons. Christy, again, you gained access to this. It seems like almost an innocuous title for a prison, but far from innocuous. Red Onion Prison, which is a supermax prison in Virginia. And in watching the film, which, by the way, is shown tomorrow at 5:30, I just want to let you know that you can watch this tomorrow at 5:30. You have an inmate who you start with at the beginning and you end with. And he's referring to the guards who basically, they do a 9 to 5 or whatever their shift is, and he says they go back into the real world. And him pointing to his cell says, "This is our world," talking about solitary confinement. I'd like to ask you how you gain access to Red Onion Prison. How were you granted access, and why focus on this particular inmate? You talk about a lot of inmates, but this guy seems to be the narrative thread.
Sure. First of all, it's such an honor to be here, sitting here with you and all you incredibly accomplished journalists. And I'm here partly because I did get access. So when I started sort of exploring this subject, like in the Middle Ages when I was in college, I studied sociology, and I specifically studied criminology and the juvenile justice system. And that sort of exposure to, I worked in a courthouse, the exposure to that and the brokenness of the system is what drove me to want to make documentary films. And it's what drove me to this form, the sort of long form documentary as a means to move people about the brokenness of our systems and try and move towards improving them or rethinking them. So anyway, when I was researching this particular subject, I was looking at the issue around juveniles who are locked up in solitary, which Michael can talk more about probably. But I came across an article in the New Yorker called Hellhole that sort of described in chilling detail what happens to a human being and the human mind when deprived of any human or social interaction. And then also I came across the statistic that 100,000 people on any given day are locked in these conditions in the United States. I decided I wanted to tell that story. I decided, like, if I am, as someone who cares about these issues and follows sort of prison reform and criminal justice reform and is trying to move the needle on that, didn't know that this many people were held in basically long-term, sometimes indefinite solitary confinement, then this needs to be revealed. And at that time in 2012, there wasn't that much reporting on this. There were also a handful of states, getting to the access, who were taking some steps towards kind of reversing what was a trend for 20, 30 years of locking up more and more people in this kind of confinement, and Virginia was one of those states. So I was introduced to the director of the Department of Corrections in the state of Virginia, and I asked him to tell me about what he was doing inside this supermax prison that was built specifically to hold people in long-term solitary confinement, and they had recently implemented a program called the Step Down Program to try and reduce the number of people they were holding in 23-hour-a-day lockdown. And we started talking, and eventually I asked him if I could come and see and capture some of what he was telling me about was happening inside the prison. Mm-hmm. And I went for a visit with no cameras to see the prison and to try and understand what was happening. And I got permission to film for 3 days. A year and a half later, I finished shooting the film. So the simple answer I was just saying was that I introduced myself as who I am, a curious filmmaker, an independent filmmaker, who wanted to understand better what it is like to run a supermax, to be in prison inside of a supermax, to work inside of a supermax, and they allowed me in for those 3 days.
Briefly, it's one thing the warden to allow you access. What about the state of Virginia?
So I got permission through the Secretary of Public Safety.
What were their expectations?
I think that they were and are proud of the Step Down Program and the work that they are doing to try and reduce the number of people in solitary confinement. And the official position of most prisons is that they don't have solitary confinement, so it's called segregation. Or it was called segregation at Red Onion State Prison when I was filming. I think it's now called restrictive housing.
You know, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, they describe solitary as a form of torture. But in the United States, of course, we obviously don't. And did you raise any of these controversial questions with the warden? Not immediately, obviously, but as time went on. Did you raise the fact that this is considered a form of torture almost anywhere else in the world?
Yeah, I mean, you ask a question that I think raises something about sort of my perspective in making the film, and also I think in the context of this panel, the advantages of making a long-form film and sort of my own self-perception as a filmmaker and not necessarily a journalist. And so I went in with some expectations of what I might find, but what I've always I was sort of trained and came up working with Barbara Koppel, whose line that always stays with me is that you have to be prepared to go on the journey, and it's going to take you on twists and turns, and if you're not willing to go where the journey takes you, then don't make films. And so I raised that because when I got there, sort of my understanding of what it's like to be held in solitary confinement, to sit inside of a cell for 23 hours a day, and to not know when that will end. I had some understanding. Of course, I couldn't truly understand it until I heard, I think, the sounds, the calling out, the yells, the screaming, the sort of like madness that was just so present in some of those pods. Pods are like units. But what I didn't expect was to feel also a connection to the people who work there and to want to understand more about their experience. I think that, like we have very sort of like, aside from the people on this panel, the mainstream media often is doing like these one-dimensional portrayers of like the prisoners are bad criminals and the guards are also bad sadistic people. And neither of those are true. Of course, we are all human. And I think that like after that one day, when I spent a day there, I realized like the thing that we all share is that we're all humans. And if I can do something if I can make a film that shows that, I think that I will be accomplishing something new in terms of moving the conversation around how we incarcerate, why we incarcerate, what corrections should mean. And so it became important to me to let go of whatever judgment or ideas I might have had about what a warden of a prison like that must be like, or what guards must be thinking, and to just try and find out from them what they were feeling and thinking with a really open mind. So I didn't necessarily like question them in that way. I more tried to learn from them in a different way.
We have a clip, do we not?
Yeah. So but the guards are not in these two clips. But there are two clips to show. It's like just two consecutive clips that sort of just give you a sense of the film, the location, and we're going to show one clip and then a second clip to kind of show like another side of the story, but not the guards, COs.
The main thing that segregation means to me is extreme loneliness and boredom. That's the main thing, loneliness. Don't care how tough you are. I don't care how badass you are. You can Bruce Lee it up all day long. It gets to you, and it hurts like hell.
I feel like I've been buried alive in the ground and just everybody's just basically walking over top of you. You can hear them, but they can't hear you. That's the way I feel, forgotten, And that is not a comfortable feeling at all.
I think it's a good way of also transitioning to what segregation, what isolation does. And I think I'm not going to do this in order of the way you're seated, but I'm going to I think it's a good way to turn to Pete, who's been covering prisons for years. You're almost as old as I am, right? Right. Right. And right, you're welcome, Pete. And you've looked at the debilitative aspects of prison. Prisons, of course, purport to be about rehabilitation, and we've seen various manifestations of what prisons look like in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then now in this particular century. Can you talk about what segregation does, the type of situations portrayed in Christie's film here, Solitary?
Well, first I'd like to compliment you on getting this film made. And I also am struck by how little has changed and in fact has gotten worse. I was granted unlimited access in 1987 to the U.S. Penitentiary in Leavenworth, which is a maximum security. At that time, there was only one higher, Marion, which you are familiar with, where it was under lockdown. And a lot of what your interviews show could be reflected in my book. They say the same thing, and we talk about it. And that period in the 70s, the director of the Bureau of Prisons really thought they could cure crime. If you got a guy with therapy, if you got a guy in education, if you got him counseling, then he would be redeemed and rehabilitated and you could send him out. Well, it didn't work. And so in the 80s, under Norman Carlson, who was the director of the Bureau of Prisons, one of the best leaders it had, they said, we're not about rehabilitation, we're really about isolation. It's our job to make sure a person gets their civil rights met, and make sure they don't go over the wall, but isolation is the punishment. We're not about punishment, but we also are not about rehabilitation. That's up to an individual, and that was kind of a cultural shift. And in the 90s, of course, that's when the big boom came. And because of what happened at Marion with Thomas Silverstein and Clay Fountain, when they murdered 2 correctional officers, we created lockdowns, and then that is what grew into the supermaxes. And so that's kind of a little historical context. My interest of late has been, while the populations in prisons, for instance, in California is declining because they're so expensive, one group is actually escalating, growing by as much as from 16 to 20%, and that's persons with mental illness. And I'm not talking about, you can be a bipolar bank robber. I'm talking about folks who have schizophrenia and bipolar disorder who get picked up for things like trespassing, and then they get caught up in the system. A woman I followed down in Miami, 3 strikes rule, 5 years mandatory prison, because she shoved people at a bus stop because she thought they were stealing their thoughts. And it was done intentionally to get her off the street because they didn't know how to help her. And so we know that these people are also, there's no statistics, but some studies have shown that that's a higher proportion of people being put into solitary, simply because jails either don't have the staff, facilities, or they don't know what to do with these folks. So when they smear themselves with feces, when they act out, when they spit, throw urine on an officer, then they're going to be thrown into one of these solitary confinement cells, which of course exacerbates your mental illness. We do know that in California, over a 5-year study, more than 50% of all suicides happen to people in solitary confinement. In California, there was another study that said 65% all happened in solitary confinement. We don't know how many people with mental illness are actually in solitary confinement, but there was a study done in New York where he talked to hundreds of people in solitary confinement, and 1/3 were actively psychotic while they were in solitary confinement. So your point, which you brought up earlier about locking yourself into a bathroom, which Thomas Silverstein suggested I do at one point to see what it's like, an 80-foot cell with a steel door, with a concrete bed that you can be 4-pointed on, and a sink combination sink and a commode, and depending on where you are, what other privileges you might get, that has to affect your mental health. One of the reasons I like what you said, Christy, is we tend to look at it, and because we're human beings, we go, oh, that's horrible. You got to remember, what do you do with somebody like Thomas Silverstein, who was charged with 4 murders, including the murder of a correctional guard, member of the Aryan Brotherhood? What do you do with somebody who throws water on the floor, covers themselves with butter, and says, come on in here, I want to kill you? How do you control those people? And the other thing is, one of the things I really like that you said is how this affects the correctional officers. Going to work every day in situations that can be demeaning to you and threatening to you and their mental health. And that's an area that, because of the culture, is rarely talked about, but really has, that's the other flip side of the coin, is how does an institution and solitary itself affect both the persons in it and the guardians who are keeping that?
You have, what are statistics on mental illness? You had cited those specifically.
Well, there are more than 365,000 people with...
Out of how many?
Out of the prison population? Oh gosh, I'm pulling off 2 million or
2
so.
million.
Thank you. It's usually about 16% There have been some studies that say, oh, 50% of people in prisons have a mental illness. Well, a lot of that's situational. I mean, the Justice Department did a study where they said, 50% have a mental illness or diagnosable mental illness. Well, yeah, one of the questions was, are you depressed? Well, hell, I'm in prison. What do you think? So I'm talking about serious mental illnesses, schizophrenia being one of the prime ones, bipolar disorder, and severe and persistent depression.
I was just going to add one more thing about the statistics around mental illness inside prisons, which is that there's not a whole lot of transparency about what's going on inside of our prisons, obviously. Both federal and state, and how a prison defines mental illness could also go in the other direction, which is like, I think sometimes people who do have mental illness might not qualify as being mentally ill on the statistics.
It generally is looked at whether you're taking a psychotropic medication, but you really bring up an interesting point, because the ultimate supermax, which was caused by Silverstein and Fountain, is Florence ADX, where it's
in Colorado.
A complete prison of segregation. Plus, inside that, I mean, you have your normal prison with your GP, then you have your special housing unit, and then you have segregation. Well, out there you have your segregation starts right there, and then it goes down to what Silverstein is, which is that now the Bureau of Prisons doesn't acknowledge, which is no human contact, and just that itself seems very, very, very chilling. So they say, the Bureau of Prisons says, no individuals with mental illness are held in Florence. We just don't put them there because it's not right. Well, the Atlantic's done a series of articles about people there who have committed suicide, who have one guy gouged out his own eye, who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, a long history of it that contributed to them going there and their actions. And I'm talking about things like threatening the President of the United States during one of your psychotic rants, and you end up ending up in some place like Florence. So I think your point is very well taken. It's how you define it. And if you want to say, well, we don't have anybody with mental illness here because, we just don't, well, yeah, well, you might want to take a little closer look.
You just used the word transparent and a lack of transparency. I mean, it's a fact. And because of that lack of transparency, journalists have always tried to find ways of telling the story. You found a very unique way as a filmmaker. You went there. The Guardian and Reveal, the Center for Investigative Reporting, have both taken two different approaches to this a revelatory examination of prison conditions and segregation. And Ed, at The Guardian, let's start with you. I'd like you to discuss, how you were able to portray to an audience the type of conditions that are occurring within segregation in places like Florence, Colorado, where, by the way, the Jahar Tsarnaev is housed. That's the marathon bomber, and where Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, is housed, and a number of other people of that sort.
It's great to be here. Christie's film is absolutely sensational. It's fantastic. And I'm incredibly jealous of the access you got, but that's just the start of it. With that access, you've told a really sensitive and eye-opening story, I think. And it kind of fits very much with what we tried to do, because kind of we begin where you stop, because your camera goes up to the door of the cell. And then there is one clip where you take us in to an empty cell, but basically you're looking through the door, aren't you? Through this very small window at the prisoners pacing up and down inside the cell. We thought to ourselves, what can we do with new technology and new tools to actually take you, the viewer, into the cell and be the prisoner? And it was built on our journalism, so this was not a work of fiction. Personally, I've done a lot of work with the Angola 3 down in Louisiana, reporting on their 43 years in solitary confinement, which, if you stop to think about it for a second, is in itself jaw-dropping. And from that journalism, we thought, how do we use the new digital materials that we've got at our disposal to, as I say, take you inside the cell? So a colleague of mine in London, who importantly has an audio background, and I'll say why that's important in a minute. She thought, okay, let's see what we can do with virtual reality, which, as everyone knows, is the goggles you get through the New York Times if you've received the cardboard, or increasingly Oculus, because of gaming, is increasingly going down the virtual reality route. Google is about to bring out their own goggles, so I think once Google gets behind it, we're going to start to see it become more a part of our lives. And The Guardian's first virtual reality film is called 6x9, not 8x10 in your cells, but 6x9 in ours. And we built up from journalism. We had 7 interviews with former solitary confinement prisoners who kind of downloaded their experiences to us. And we also talked to a lot of psychologists who have studied the subject of what happens to you when you're in solitary. And through that information, we then created an animated cell using computer-generated imagery, CGI, and using, I have to be careful here because I'm a complete ignoramus on the subject, but the programming that you would use in a video game to create an animated cell. So I don't know if anyone here has seen it. This is a problem with virtual reality because not many people have. You've seen it, okay.
Well, you have a clip. You have a clip, correct?
We have, I mean, we could show the, should we show the clip now? Oh, yeah, great. So let's show the clip. The clip is obviously 2-dimensional, so it's giving you a very, very poor sense of what we're talking about. But if we saw the clip, I could then...
Welcome to your cell. You're going to be here for 23 hours a day.
You are going to undergo many different kinds of reactions, and some of them will be more immediate than others.
Keep your eye on survival.
Memorize your space. After a while, things start to slip.
I find myself floating.
The toilet that drips choo. Stupid.
People turn on themselves.
It's almost like you want to feel alive.
You do something to make them notice you. So, now that you're here, what are you going to do? What can you do?
6x9, a virtual experience of solitary confinement.
Okay, so the voices that you hear in that are the people, the real solitary confinement prisoners who we interviewed. Crucially, the audio, which is also 3-dimensional. So you're wearing the goggles with earbuds in. You can move around, you can look around the cell, you can, when I did it, I found myself trying to reach out for the books. But the audio is also 3-dimensional. So if you move, you'll hear the sounds in your cell. And when I saw your film, Christy, it took me straight back to our film because the audio, in a way, the sounds are almost the most disturbing part of the experience in your film and in ours. And the audio was taken from a Frontline documentary. The Frontline very kindly gave us 25 hours of audio from a documentary they made in a Supermax in Maine. So it's the real sounds, very similar to the sounds you hear at Red Onion Prison in your film. So we put all these together and we told the story using, as you could see from the clip, sort of print on the walls. So we use print on the walls to tell you basic facts about solitary, to also talk about the psychological impact. The film lasts for 9 minutes, which is, sounds like it's an incredibly long time for any digital film these days in terms of website news sites like ours. But we thought it needed to be quite long in order to start to give you that effect on yourself of, wow, this is what it's really like. And sure enough, after 9 minutes, most people come out of having seen the film kind of profoundly disturbed by it in a quite personal way. But yet to extend the viewer through 9 minutes is a challenge of storytelling because there's various pitfalls we could have fallen into, which I think we have avoided incredibly cleverly, my colleagues in London who did the film. We could have fallen into the pitfall of being sensationalist, into making it entertaining. And we wanted to avoid that. But equally, how do you portray the quintessential thing about solitary, which is sheer boredom, is the overwhelming part of the experience? How do you portray that in 9 minutes without boring the viewer to stop watching. So that was a big challenge for us pulling the film together. But I think what it shows you is that if you apply new types of storytelling, you can take people, you can overcome the access issue for a start, which if you're not as persistent and brilliant as Christy is, like, floors a lot of us. I personally have never been inside a maximum security supermax prison, even though I've written about them a lot over many years. I've never had the opportunity to do that. It allows you to get over the access problem, but it also takes people into a different psychological space where they can imagine it in a different way.
That's what I was wondering about, that psychological space, that space between madness and insanity. And the imagination, of course, becomes easy, I guess, to imagine if you're there. I mean, you must have felt a lot of this, even as a filmmaker, day after day, hearing the screams, or day after day, seeing this three-dimensional revolving, like cell, which is taking you nowhere. It's taking you 6 by what?
9.
6 by 9. I mean, what a world, a 6 by 9 world. There are other ways of telling the story too that have basically given us access, if you will, inside the life of a prison and inside solitary confinement. And that is through a first-person experience that the Center for Investigative Reporting was able to establish in cooperation with Mother Jones magazine. And Michael, what happened, we're talking about a reporter who basically got a job as a guard, and in his role as a guard, was able to chronicle what is happening inside this prison and to write out for both Mother Jones and for Reveal how that was impacting him, how it impacted him, how it impacted the inmates. Can you talk about that? And
yes.
that collaboration also with Mother Jones.
Yes, absolutely. Maybe we can start with the audio clips, just so people can have a little bit of a framework for what we're talking about here. There's 2 clips. One is the first minute of the radio. We did an hour for public radio and podcast.
I recommend you all listen.
Thank you. In collaboration with Mother Jones. This is very much their story. I want to get that clear from the get-go. This is Shane Bauer's story. He worked as a prison guard for 4 months and collected hundreds of hours of tape that he recorded using a watch that took video and a pen that took audio. And so my involvement in this is really, he showed up with a hard drive with hundreds of hours of tape and sort of dropped it on the desk. So all credit to him for doing the hard part. I mean, I can relate to what you were saying about living in this world sort of vicariously. And for me, I spent 4 months, 40 to 60 hours a week living with the sound and the imagery of this. And even being that far removed, my personal physical safety was never, I was never at risk. I didn't take the risks that Shane took. I had, as I said, very much what I consider to be the easy part of this project, but definitely felt the blowback of just living with these images and these sounds definitely seep deep inside. So I can only imagine what it would be like to go through. But why don't we set it up by playing the tape? It's the first minute of the show, and then there will be a big jump to one of the scenes from the hour.
I don't know how you let go of it.
My dad's an ex-journalist in his late 60s.
This is the wrong.
Wrong tape?
Wrong clip. Yeah, this would be the Reveal radio hour, audio only, so it should be an MP3 or a WAV file.
Mm-hmm. That was a different show, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I tell you, while they're setting up, well, let's...
yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit more about the process as they try to find the clip. So this was an interesting story. I've done work on prisons in the past and have had an interest in the criminal justice system for quite some time. I haven't told the story a lot, but I told someone last night, and they said you should mention this at the panel, but in 2004, I was covering the Republican National Convention in New York City, and I was caught up in one of these mass arrests and ended up spending 2 days in jail in New York City, and so I got to see the inside of a detention facility, and that really changed my entire outlook on our criminal justice system, experiencing it firsthand from inside of a cell. The conditions inside were deplorable, and just this sort of, you grow up in this country and we have these sort of assumptions about how free we are, which is true until you end up on the wrong side of the law, whether or not you broke any laws. Once you're inside, everything changes. And so to be held even just for 48 hours without access to a lawyer, without access to your basic constitutional rights, to a phone call or any of these types of things, that was my experience. And this is actually commonplace. And you spoke about how the interrelationship between race, when you refer to the new Jim Crow, race and the way that this is part of the criminal justice system. I think it's common, and the New York Civil Liberties Union has done quite a bit of research on this, but for African American males, it's common to spend over 24 hours inside a jail without access to a lawyer in New York City, even though it's against the law, and it's against state law.
And I think and what's relevant also to this entire panel is the approximation to Jim Crow, the system of racial control that was present in this country for over 60 years. Prisons are an exact replica of that in terms of societal control. And solitary, again, is just another aspect of that. And I'm raising this in the context that in looking at your film, Christy, I was struck also by the fact that there were no African American or Latino guards. Not to say that makes a difference a lot of times, because this whole notion of implicit bias sweeps across an entire group of people, no matter what color they are. But it was interesting to note that they were, one guard said, if I wasn't doing this, I'd be working in the coal mine. And we're looking at, if I can imply from that, we're looking at constituents of one of the current presidential candidates, which is Donald Trump, working the prisons. And many of the people behind the bars, if they could vote, would possibly be constituents of another Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton. Can you talk about that, this whole notion of the segregation of prisoners, not in just within the prisons, but within society? Because you're talking about a segregation that extends beyond the bars. I'd like to throw that out to the panel, and then
Sure.
wait, Michael, for your clip to. Oh, are we? Okay.
I mean, I will. I think that's an excellent point, and actually segues well into this piece. So when we're talking about race in prison, so Shane Bauer spent 4 months inside Wynn Correctional Facility.
That's right.
The population is 75% African American, are incarcerated there, but the majority of the staff is also African American, and I think what you find is, one of my big takeaways from this story is that the guards are very much exploited and victims of larger socioeconomic problems that we suffer from. So the town that this prison is in, there are not a lot of opportunities for employment. A lot of the guards here
This is a private
prison, and people are making $8 an hour, and a lot of the guards are single mothers, and a lot of the guards are there's veterans, and there are people who have no other economic opportunities, so they find themselves in these situations. And in the case of Wynn Prison, which is chronically understaffed, you have sometimes 24 guards for 1,500 prisoners. So you can see how the guards, as you mentioned, there's a lot of gray here. There's not a lot of black and white. It's everyone in this prison is a victim of this situation. So with that, you can go ahead and roll the clips.
From the Center for Investigative Reporting and PRX, this is Revealed. I'm Al Ledson. When journalist Shane Bauer went to work as a guard at a private prison, he didn't know what he was getting into.
We got to the gate of this unit, and the
guard on staff opened the gate and said to us, "Welcome to the hellhole. Welcome to the dungeon."
Shane documented his time as an employee inside the Corrections Corporation of America's Wynn Correctional Center in Louisiana.
I mean, right now, I'm afraid of, getting caught. I feel like it's pretty unlikely that I'm gonna be able to pull this off.
But he did pull it off, and he brings us an unfiltered look at life inside an American private prison. That's today on Reveal. But first, this news.
So it cuts ahead to another clip. There should be a second clip there, which is from much later in the hour.
I can't step over. It didn't take long for me to be dealing with people that are kind of taking advantage of me and would push me too far. I start writing people up a lot, showing people that I wasn't weak, and that kind of became my mission in a way.
I already wrote it up. I didn't have your name on it. I already wrote it up. When? Yesterday.
At the beginning of Shane's 8th week at Wynn, he walks into Ash Unit and is hit with the smell of human waste. In one of the dorms, brown liquid is oozing out of the shower drain. Inmates tell Shane there are worms squirming on the floor. Shane and the other COs start letting inmates out into the yard when Bako slams the gate closed. He calls on the radio, code blue, inmate assault in progress. Shane runs to the gate.
Break it up, come on.
There are two guys that are basically grappling, and they're separated from me and Bako by the bars.
Break it up, come on. Break it up.
They're both kind of trying to hold each other off. They both have shanks in their hands.
A shank is a handmade knife.
They're trying to prevent the other person from being able to swing up and stab down. When I, was in training, our instructor told us, let them cut each other. I mean, just stand there, tell them to stop, and call for backup. We don't intervene. We just shout for them to stop.
Come on.
There's a bunch of inmates standing around just quietly kind of watching. It feels almost mundane. And at one point, one of them breaks his arm free and swings up and jabs down into the other guy's neck.
I'll do it like some cheese. Ain't stopping up, big dog. What's up with stopping this?
I guess he hit his ear. He cut off a piece of his earlobe. I mean, there's really nothing I can do except call on my radio, and we're just, standing there. We didn't have, pepper spray. We didn't have billy clubs. All we had was a radio. And even the radios were new. I mean, 6 months before I was there, the guards didn't even have radios.
Weapon involved at Ash A2. Weapon involved at Ash A2.
The fight lasts for about 4 minutes until someone from SORT, or the Special Operations Response Team, shows up.
Everybody lay down. Lay down.
They're the only ones who carry weapons and ammo like plastic buckshot, electrified shields, and pepper spray.
He sprays the guys that are stabbing each other, and that's it.
Come on.
Cuffs them and takes them out. In the first 4 months of 2015, CCA reported 200 weapons found at Wynn. That's 23 times more than were found at Angola, which is a maximum security prison.
So why are there so many more weapons at Wynn? Well, Shane says they didn't have the staff to constantly search for them.
Every day, when I came in for my shift, we would have a meeting, and I would count how many people were there. And sometimes there would be 24 guards there for 1,500 inmates. There often were not enough staff to keep the prison running the way it was supposed to.
CCA later told Shane he was too low on the totem pole to understand their staffing policies. But the company's contract with Louisiana spells it out pretty clearly. They're supposed to have 36 guards show up for work at 6 a.m. every day.
Yeah, so that's kind of a long clip, but it it speaks to a number of different points here, right? And so, first of all, the entire framework of private prisons and is a conversation that's becoming part of the national dialogue as Obama and the Department of Justice recently stated that they're winding down contracts with private prisons at the federal level. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what that means. That actually only affects these immigrant prisons for non-citizens who are being held. It's a very small percentage just within the federal system. But the majority of prisoners and private prisons are state prisons. And those are run by the same companies. The big players are CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, GEO Group, and the same people that the Department of Justice is no longer going to do business with because the conditions in their prisons are not as safe as state-run prisons, don't provide basic medical services at the level that state-run prisons do, and a number of other reasons that they've chosen not to do business with these companies. Well, these same companies, CCA and GEO Group, are the same ones running the state prisons. So the work is not over with regards to the private prison problem in this country. And these are publicly traded companies. There are people profiting. There are CEOs making millions of dollars off of this, which just seems like from jump a conflict of interest, because the longer people stay in these prisons, the more money these guys make. The less medical services they provide, the more these guys make. So it's quite disturbing. And the other thing I'll say, before we move on is, what really struck me about this is that these conditions are make state-run prisons look like a place you'd much rather be. And prisoners said time and time again, I would so much rather be at Angola than at Wynn, because there's less weapons there, they control the place.
And Angola, of course, being a notorious
prison. And so we're talking about 22 times more weapons found there. We're talking about the sexual violence, the physical violence, the health care, and general control of the prison is far superior at a place like Angola than it is at Wynn, which is a medium security prison.
Let's open this up to all of you. Comments?
I'd like to add that those same companies, at least one of them you mentioned, have branched out into state mental hospitals, and that's another issue to be discussed at some point. Or, as the Guardian pointed out in this horrific case at Hampton Roads, where we had a person who was arrested for stealing $5 worth of snack food, spent 101 days in the jail, literally starved till he had a heart attack, and nobody paid any attention to him, even though he was supposed to be seen by a nurse every day by a private company. So this is very worrisome.
And I think it sort of goes back to what you were talking about in terms of the new Jim Crow and who's profiting, which are corporations off of whose lives. And I think it goes beyond. So there's the issue in Red Onion, certainly, of a primarily white staff and largely minority and urban, and so this is in Appalachia, urban people who are locked up, but also what I found, the thing that was so, I think, difficult as someone who got access inside was the responsibility I felt to people who have become the most forgotten and made the most invisible, which is largely minority or poor people who have been found guilty of a crime, who don't have an innocence claim, who literally do not, if you don't have a family who's somehow advocating on your behalf, have nobody who is in any way concerned about your welfare or your civil rights or your human rights. And I felt that we as a society, sort of allow that in some ways by just not being outraged by our criminal justice and our correction systems. And I think that we need to vastly change what we do. And Pete was talking about, like before the 70s, I mean, there was a time where there wasn't as much of us and them. These prisons, these supermax prisons, were built very specifically to create an us and them situation in which there is no communicating. It is literally when I'm trying to talk to someone inside a supermax cell. Okay, so you've got the steel door, and you know this because you've been corresponding with Tommy Silverstein, who's been held in these conditions. But even more so, like when they built these, they didn't build it so that you could communicate with the guard who's come to your window. So to listen, you have to put your ear to where the like crack between the door and the wall are. That's the way you could listen the best. But then you're missing out on eye contact, which is an essential part of human conversation and human interaction. So I had to choose like read lips and have eye contact or try and go back and forth. But the point is like it's constructed to not be conducive to having a human experience both for the people who work there and the people who are locked up there. So I think that kind of represents what is wrong, and that we need to have a big paradigm shift. It's not just about little tweaks.
Well, I think you're spot on. I mean, it's this whole notion of dehumanization is concomitant with this new prison push. I mean, we think about prisons in the 1970s. I think we had, a population of about 300,000 in the 1970s. Then we had the so-called war on drugs in the 1980s, pushed the prison population up exponentially to, as was pointed out, 2 million. And Ed, you were going to...
Yeah, I wanted to say, I mean, we're talking about the new Jim Crow thesis and the whole race angle. I've done a lot of work with the Angola 3, as I mentioned earlier. They were the longest standing solitary confinement prisoners in America, 43 years. Albert Woodfox, who came out about 6 months ago, after 43 years in total isolation. Incredibly sane. I mean, he's an extraordinary person. He's able to talk about his experience in a way that actually I thought from your film, Christy, the prisoners are incredibly articulate about what they're going through. I mean, astonishingly so. But Albert Woodfox and Herman Wallace, who also did 41 years before he was released, 3 days before he died, because the state of Louisiana was generous enough to let him out with terminal cancer as he was literally on his deathbed. They were framed up for a murder of a prison guard in 1973. And the reason they were framed up for the murder of a prison guard was because they formed a chapter of the Black Panthers, and they were actively organizing, particularly African-American prisoners in Angola prison, to try and desegregate the prison. It was a segregated prison, and that's what they were trying to do. At the time, black prisoners were taken out to the cotton fields to pick cotton in chain gangs. This was in 1973. So the whole thesis of the, direct connection between slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, into the prisons, into the solitary confinement parts of prisons, totally without a break, was exactly why, the longest standing prisoners in America in solitary confinement came out of the fight against, cotton-picking African-American chain gangs. I mean, once you hear the story, you just think this is kind of unreal.
Angola was a plantation before it was a prison.
That's right. It was it was a plantation.
There's a continuity there that's an undeniable continuity. It says it all.
This is extraordinary, and I'm not sure how much time we have left, but what I'd like to do is open this panel discussion up to the audience for a few minutes. So you, miss, let me give you this.
Will you introduce yourself?
Please, yeah, introduce yourself. Oh, that looks like you. Okay, all right.
Hi, everyone. First, I just want to say thank you so much for your work and what you do. My name is Dara Baldwin. I'm a senior public policy analyst for the National Disability Rights Network. And we didn't mention people with disabilities in prisons, the people you're talking about, and not just mental illness. Deaf people, like you were talking about having a conversation, They have no ASL interpreters in prison. They don't talk to their families. There's no video relay for them. National Disability Rights is the national organization for the protection and advocacy programs. Those are the civil rights lawyers for people with disabilities. Our lawyers do have permission to go into any institution unannounced, go wherever they wish, and speak to whomever they wish and look at any records. And we do on a regular basis. We have a program called AVID, Amplifying the Voices of Inmates with Disabilities, AVID, and you can Google it, and they are taping people in prison in solitary confinement and all of that stuff because we can go in there. They go in on a daily basis. My question to you guys is, did you see anything around people with disabilities and any conversation around that? And not just mental illness. When people think of that, there are people in wheelchairs, right? There are people who are deaf, who are blind, and especially people who go in with no disability, but then it's an onset, and it happens to them for what happened with no medical services.
Well, yes. I mean, there's an individual in the radio story, a man who caught gangrene while at Wynn Prison, and after numerous complaints to the medical staff, he was never allowed to see a doctor. They gave him Motrin, which they take $10 out of his account for and send him back to his cell until he lost both his legs and all his fingers from gangrene, and has a lawsuit that is now going against the prison. And at the time that Shane met him, and I've seen the footage of this guy, this has only been 8 months. He went in with both his legs and all his fingers, and you know, because of the lack of medical services, is now obviously disabled for life. You know, this is one example, but there are many. I mean, that was obviously very disturbing. But again, I mean, when correctional facility was closed down, but CCA that ran Wynn runs many other prisons, and that's, yeah. So I think those conditions, you're going to find them throughout as soon as you start looking.
I'd like to comment on that because I'm very familiar with your organization and also with P&A. And you guys have done outstanding work in South Carolina. I mean, it's just been phenomenal. And no, not in Virginia. No, you haven't. You haven't done anything about the case in Hampton Roads. And that's very disappointing because if you folks aren't there, no one else is. And so I very compliment you on being there in South Carolina and really suing the state and bringing about change. You did a phenomenal job down there. Yeah. Now do something in Virginia. Yeah, take it back.
Another thing you commonly find that Shane found, you know, consistently is that people's medical complaints were ignored, whether they're physical or mental health complaints. And what he did point out is that sometimes prisoners do fake ailments in order to get out of solitary or to get out of general population. But these very serious medical concerns are often ignored, and people with disabilities often bear the heavy brunt of that. And there was another individual who complained frequently of you know, he was having suicidal thoughts and was on hunger strike to protest the conditions of the prison. And eventually, even though he demanded to be put on suicide watch where he would have one-on-one observation, was never put there and ended up hanging himself. And at the time he died, he weighed 71 pounds. So he went in at 160, not a small guy, went in at 160 pounds, and the coroner's report listed him at 71 pounds. So this overall neglect is pervasive, and obviously, I mean, these are conditions that are shocking, to say the least, but this is going on right now as we speak. This is happening in the United States. Yeah.
But I'd like to get back to your original point is that persons who have like some kind of disability, they are, you know, I've been to 48 states in the last 10 years. I've toured hundreds of prisons. Very rarely do you find anyone. I have a sister-in-law who is deaf. You find no one who can communicate with those people. You don't have access. Most of the older prisons cannot accommodate wheelchairs, so you're forced to carry people, which is very dehumanizing. I mean, that is one area that is constantly overlooked. Mental illness is starting to come to the forefront, but you're absolutely correct.
Let me ask the panel this question, and then I'll ask very briefly, if you will. What about inmates who say, look, I'm subject to sexual assault. I'm subject to getting beaten up. I interviewed the lawyer. And I actually interviewed the inmate. I'm just remembering now. At San Quentin by phone years ago. His last name is Lieb. This was an inmate who is a gigantic guy, but he white guy, Jewish. His problem was that he was being housed with the Aryan Nation because he's white. And he was not being explicit about his Jewishness. And one day he basically wanted to embrace his Judaic tradition. And they found out he was Jewish. Again, white guy who had been housed with the Aryan Nation. The question became, where do you put this guy? That was the question his lawyer had. The lawyer sued the state of California, said there's no way you can continue housing this guy with neo-Nazis. A guy with a big swastika on his head waking up next to you, you know. And so the question became, should he be segregated or should he be put in as he wanted to be, in a population of largely Asian inmates, fearing that he would be safer among these Asian inmates. So what about this whole notion of, but then the other option was segregation.
Can I give you a bit of a sort of fantasy mind trip on that, because it just made me have this thought, which is Donald Trump, how all this comes back to Donald Trump. If you think of Californian prisons, the solitary confinement cells in California are stocked full of Latino gangs. And they partly have such an extraordinarily high solitary confinement ratio in California because they say that's the only way they can deal with Latino gangs in their prison system. But it's such a brutal response to a real problem that all it succeeds in doing is hardening and making more revengeful some very hard people who come in hard and they come out incredibly hard. They're then deported and they're sent to Central America, back to El Salvador and Guatemala. And we've seen in the last 5-10 years, there's been a massive murder surge in those countries, which has led to an exodus of particularly women and children going north to flee, gang murders. They end up in the Mexican border with the US. Last year, we saw that surge of kids coming over, created a big moral panic, and now what do we get? We got Donald Trump talking about building his wall. So it's not a ridiculous sort of flight of fancy to go from solitary confinement in California to the creation of the Trump monster that we're now having to live with.
Interesting.
To answer your question, though, the alternative usually is PC, protective custody, which brings with it its own set of problems, because once you're in PC, you're seen as a rat, and it's very difficult to go back to the general population. But prison officials are very aware of this, and what they try to do is keep an equal balance. For instance, in the federal system, keep the number of white inmates and the number of black inmates. And in Leavenworth, when I was there, they were very creative because they kept white, Aryan Brotherhood, et cetera, and it's not all just Aryan Brotherhood, whites over here, African Americans, other minorities over here, and the mafia in between them, thinking that that was some kind of a buffer. But you have these different prisons. One of the biggest people who get preyed on in prison are transgender. And the prisons, just as they're not set up to deal with people with disability, how do you deal with somebody who's transgender when they're brought in? And unfortunately, these are usually very small populations, and so there's no alternative but to say, well, you should just check into PC, or how would you like to be in solitaire? So
a lawsuit out of Texas, in fact, relevant to that. Please.
I was just going to bring up another story from the private prisons radio hour, and Mother Jones' story is that there was a case of a guy who was in protective custody and segregation, and after 4 months in segregation, he wanted out, and he was, just to use some prison parlance, because this is how he's referred to throughout the story by the COs and the other prisoners, he was a punk, which meant that he was kept as someone in sexual servitude to another man there in his unit. And when he came out of protective custody, he was beaten with a lock and a sock, like a weapon, prison-made weapon. And so we have tape footage of this beating and the aftermath of the beating. And after the beating, he was told to go back to the same unit where his old man, is how he's referred to, the man who was keeping him in sexual servitude, lived. So they were trying to send him back to the same unit with the same guy, where the same guy lived. Now, the guy who had beaten him up was taken off because of the beating. He was removed, but when he tried to go back on his unit, no one else would let him back into the unit because they saw him as a snitch because he had spent time in protective custody. So now he's faced with a situation where they say either you can go back to segregation, protective custody, which is segregation, solitary confinement, or you can go back on the unit where now you don't have any protection because the guy who was looking after you just beat you up and is now gone, so you risk being raped or becoming someone else's punk. And he chose to go back to the unit where he risked sexual assault and servitude over going back to segregation because it was so difficult to survive mentally in segregation. And that's one anecdote, but what it illustrates is the larger systemic abuse, and the guards are complicit because they know what's going on. They won't, according to Shane, they would stop a rape if they saw one in progress, but the systemic abuse of keeping people in sexual servitude is understood, everyone knows it happens, and they allow it to happen, and they provide no protection, no special services, and there's really no way out of it except to go to solitary. So those are the two places as a transgender individual that you can end up in these in incarceration.
Kristen?
And I mean, I'd say that in my experience, both filming inside Red Onion with the individuals that I spent a lot of time with, and talking to quite a few survivors, people who are out on the outside now, who experience solitary confinement. I think that it's very natural for people to think prisons are violent, all these things can happen. If I was in prison, I'd want to be in solitary, right? But again, then try it, and you might find that it's not a solution. So I mean, I don't have the solution, but I just wanted to say two things. One is, countless times, I heard from people who didn't wind up in the finished film, but who I spent some time with, is like, if you treat us like animals, we will behave like animals. So I think that's like the fundamental issue here. Whether
and these are people, of course, who some will eventually be released.
Exactly, and 90 to 95%, depending on who you ask, but 90 to 95% of people who are inside prison will one day be on the other side. And so I just think, education inside prisons will help to mitigate against the violence. Programs and education and treating each person like an individual versus a number. It sounds pie in the sky, but there are places in other countries, for example, Germany and Norway, where you see results. So I think that, and as far as like someone who does, there are situations in which a person needs to be separated from the general population for any number of reasons. But the conditions in which that person is held when they're being separated do not need to look like what they look like now.
I don't think it's pie in the sky. I think that actually that's another thing that was extraordinary about Shane Bauer's reporting, is that we have tape of the guards saying these guys need more activities, right? Because if they're busy, then they're not thinking about how to get me, right? So the activities that they provide, the training, education, hobbies, trades, those are the things that actually reduce violence in the prison. So it's not like a reward, it actually makes the whole environment safer. And so there are practical reasons to do that. And then the other side of that is we have prisoners saying they need to pay these guards more because they don't take their job seriously. So the place is very unsafe because they're not checking to make sure people aren't making shanks.
And again, if you look at Norway, you see guards who are trained and are educated, trained, paid well.
That's right.
And a prison population who's busy.
You're talking about two different levels of prisons, though, in a way. What the creation of the Supermax was really created for people who graduated out of all those. I mean, I think 85% of correctional officers, 85% of prisoners simply want to do their time and go home. And 15% basically cause a lot of the problems. So what do you do with the worst of the worst? Well, you create a supermax, and then you have people who do not, I think the programs, everything work, but these are people who the Bureau of Prisons and others don't know what to do with. And so they keep them in solitary just, because they've murdered a prison guard or whatever. One of the things, though, I'd like to hit on is I correspond a lot with Tommy Silverstein, and it's interesting because what I've seen over the 30-some years I've known him is that what keeps...
Just if you could explain briefly, yeah. He's the inmate where? Silverstein.
Tommy Silverstein was a member of the Aryan Brotherhood. He was accused of killing he went into the system very young, his father and his uncle, and he robbed a bank out of California. He went into the system. He was falsely accused of murdering someone, or they overturned it. He ended up going to Marion, where he killed a black inmate, stabbed him a number of times, dragged his body up and down the tier, horrific stuff. Then they put him in a cell next to the leader of the DC Blacks, which was Cadillac Smith, who then tried to kill him, so he killed him. So this was a case of where they knew these two guys were going to be volatile, but they put them right next to each other. So anyway, and eventually he murders a prison guard, Merrill Klutz. For the first 9 months, because they didn't have a death penalty, they put him in his underwear, in a cell, with absolutely nothing, 2 people watching him who wouldn't talk to him out of respect, with the lights on 24 hours a day for 9 months. And then they discovered you can't control someone if you don't give them something, so they gave him a TV. And gradually, when I met him, contrary, and I'll be real brief here, to what the sounds you heard, he was in the basement of Leavenworth where there was no sound, locked up 24 hours with the lights on with only cold water. And this gets to the point, when you dehumanize someone, regardless of what they've done, back to your animals comment, I mean, I've gotten to know him really well, and what keeps him going is defiance and just how people talk about they're not going to break me, but also people talk about the power of love. Well, there's a real power of hate, too. And the idea that I'm not going to let these guys beat me, and if I ever get my chance. And so you foster that, and you create this situation, this dynamic where somebody feels so much outrage. One real quick thing, and I will shut up. Mm-hmm. I just got a letter from him last week. He was moved without explanation into a cell that had no toilet, nothing but a steel concrete thing for 4-point, with that steel door you're talking about. Now, he's the same age I am. He's in his 60s. He needed urinate. There was no place to urinate. So he asked his guards, correctional officer, can you give me, oh yeah, we'll get around to it. It's freezing cold. Can you give me a blanket? Well, after 8 hours, they finally gave him a blanket that had been covered with feces. And this is someone, when you murder a correction officer, you're going to be lower than low. He said, look, I have to urinate. I have to do anything. So he ends up going to the steel door and trying to pee out through the crack, trying to, spray somebody walking by. Now, if you're an outsider, you look at that and go, well, this guy's an animal. This is hard. But those are the kind of conditions that create this kind of behavior. And I'm not saying that, he's certainly not an angel, but you can't treat human beings that way and expect them to not react in a very violent way back. And that's what solitary does.
Let's do this. I'm guessing that we are out of time, but I'm not sure. And I know this gentleman had his 3 minutes. I know this gentleman had his hands up. So let's.
I think it's a very important issue we're addressing here, but it's not only in the United States the case. It's also in Switzerland the case. I have to say, I've been in solitary confinement for 220 days because I was accused of violating Swiss bank secrecy. 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, they couldn't find me guilty for violating Swiss bank secrecy, but this solitary confinement of 6 months changed me in a way which was shocking for my wife and my child. They said it took me about 4 to 5 months to come back again to be the dad and the husband I was. So my conclusion is this solitary confinement is a factory for producing mentally sick people who do not have the chance to come back anymore in society. If you say they are staying there for 40 years, I think it's even 2 years, is already enough to break a person that you can't talk to him anymore properly. Because when I was there in this solitary confinement, could walk for an hour and talk to other inmates. And there was a guy he has been there for 2 years. Talking to him, you didn't get the responses anymore of a person who can think. He's just, as you said, animal-like. It's going in that direction. He couldn't really express himself properly anymore. And they put him to prison because he took 1 kilo of drugs from Jamaica to Zurich, caught him, and they said, this guy is a big drug dealer, he is a top man, but that man actually, because I talked once in a while to him, is really an ordinary, simple person which was broken by the solitary confinement of 2 years. I'm sure this guy doesn't come back anymore and is not being able to become a decent member of our society.
Thank you very much for sharing that story. Much appreciated. Perhaps folks here could we get a chance to talk to you afterwards. We're all reporters and filmmakers here, so I'm curious. Let's conclude this discussion about segregation in prisons and about the larger prison industrial complex, really. My brother, older brother, by the way, was a prison counselor who essentially is on disability because he basically broke down after serving years working as a prison counselor in Michigan prisons, and it was something that he could not do after a period of after 18 years working as a counselor. And he did, in fact, talk about the stress of just talking with inmates. So you can imagine, and those inmates who were in segregation, so imagine being in segregation, albeit what the crime might have been, as you said. These are folks who are going to come out of prison, many of them, and they're living amongst us. And the conditions of segregation have to be reckoned with. What are the responsibilities of filmmakers, investigative journalists, to basically ensure that the American people understand the enormity of this problem? Not just the Shawshank aspects of it, but not just the contours of it, but the enormity of it, how it affects them in their neighborhoods. Ed, please.
Yeah, I mean, just a short thought. I mean, the mood that I got from Christie's film very strongly is the sense of these places being forgotten. And in fact, one of the prisoners says that he feels forgotten. And it's a very powerful phrase. And with the move towards Supermax, where people are being concentrated in places that no one gets access to, that's essentially what American society has done. It's created forgotten zones. And listening to Michael on the radio show, it's the guards who are forgotten as well. They're part of this forgotten community. And therefore, it's quite simple in a way. Our job is to make sure people don't forget and they remember what's going on and actually know about it, because the whole system is set up for the public not to know anything about it.
Yeah, and I want to thank everyone on this panel, and I look forward to going deep into all of your work, because even as someone who's done reporting and work on prisons, a lot of this is new to me. I haven't yet had a chance to see your film, and I'm looking forward to reading the work and experiencing the virtual reality thing. So thank you for the work that you do, and as a call out to everyone, people who are in the media, who are here in the audience now, as I said, yes, private prisons they're winding down contracts at the federal level, but the vast majority of these private prisons and the conditions that I described are ongoing. So it's time now for the full court press. We need to be all over this thing, because our society, we are all responsible for this. We are all paying for this out of our tax dollars. We are all voting members of this society. So while this goes on, we're all responsible for this. And as a reporter, I don't think there's anyone who's better equipped than a reporter to get this message out to the world.
Yeah, I think that you guys said it very well, and I think to Ed's point, I feel like, at least for myself, I feel a personal responsibility to use the skills that I now have acquired to tell these stories, and so that we can't say we didn't know. I'm really grateful for this festival and for all the different sort of tools that there are out there to elevate these stories so that more and more people can see them. I think it's also, I just wanted to say one thing, is that there's something else that was very shared by almost everyone I met inside that prison, and it was the experience of trauma, and this circles back to the panel that took place here before us, which had to do with police relationships and the trauma that almost every individual I met and came in touch with had experienced on the outside before they were in prison. And I think it's just, I just think it's our responsibility, certainly, and I don't think there's an issue here in terms of voting, but to vote and demand of our elected officials that we really seriously address the systemic and deep-seated problems that exist in society, outside prisons as well as inside.
I'd like to compliment you on going into Red Onion. Fabulous job, great film. And I'd also like to encourage journalists, now there's a unique moment, there's a window open. The Tampa paper won the Pulitzer last year for writing about mental illness in prisons. Sheriffs and jails are overrun with people with mental illness. They're being dumped there, and they're open to having people come in because they don't want those folks in their facilities. And so it's very possible to contact somebody who would in the past said, no, you can't come into my facility, who now will welcome you and say, look, I don't want these folks here. Come in, see what's going on. Because that's what Judge Leifman did for me down in Miami when I did my book. And they're open to it because they don't want those folks there. And it's a great story. It's an important story. And it's something we really need to address.
Can I say one more thing on that point?
Please.
And Alicia Sams was with me when we screened the film for the Department of Corrections, and I just want to say one other thing, which is that I think that, you asked me, the very first question was how did I get access? Mm-hmm. And I think that there is a desire in some ways for the truth to come out, because the only way things will change is if that happens.
Indeed.
So it's our responsibility.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you.
So I just wanted to add on to this. Thank you all for a terrific, terrific panel. And following on your comment that the truth wants to come out, we want to encourage you all to use the truth box, which is standing over there in the lobby and is waiting for you all to sort of come in and take 2 minutes and fess up to a lie, because we've all told them. And we're going to have a presentation by Yael Melamed, who's going to be, who created the truth box in the film Dishonesty. And it's sort of sitting there, and I think people think it's just kind of a display, but it's not. It's like truth is there to be used. So avail yourselves.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you.